Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming to my session. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Geoff Besko. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Advisory Services with Above Security. I'm going to give a little bit of my background in a second, but I want to say it was a pleasure actually being a sponsor to this conference or this show. I haven't been to this before actually. I've been very impressed actually with the quality of the speakers and the amount of interaction. So I'm hoping that you'll get something out of the presentation I'm going to do today. One thing that was very nice yesterday was I was at the CIO Association panel session, and I think I counted, they said enterprise security architecture at least 8 times, which actually feels really good to me because it's something that I'm very passionate about, and also something that I've been preaching as being critical actually to successfully implementing a risk management strategy from a security perspective in our organization. So what I want to do today is I want to talk a bit about how do we actually manage risk and use enterprise security architecture as a method for doing so, and looking at security and through a lens of risk as part of what we're doing, taking a more holistic approach and trying to tackle the problem as a big picture as opposed to getting down to the bits and bytes right away. And so I'm going to explain that philosophy as we go along. In terms of my background, so I've introduced myself, my title. So I have this title that suggests that I don't do anything except go to meetings and look at P&L and things like that. But actually my background is a practitioner. So I'm actually our security architecture co-practice leader within Above Security. I'm a sub-master chartered architect, and the methodology I'm going to talk about is a lot derived from SAPS, or the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture. And in terms of that certification, it's actually, there's only about between 5 or 6 of us in North America that have that level of certification. And I think maybe about 20, 25 in kind of Europe and Asia and Australia. I've been doing this for a long time. Actually, security is kind of my second career because I was focused actually on doing enterprise architecture. I used to work for EDS, and I was CIO for a period of time. And then I got into security when I joined Securus at the time, which merged with Above Security, and now we're a Hitachi company on top of that. So I've come more from an enterprise architecture strategy background and service management background. And I bring a lot of that to the table because I think that's very important perspectives as a security practitioner. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction of Above Security because I suspect for most people in this room you've never heard of us. So I want to make sure you understand who we are a little bit. And then I'm going to jump into the meat of the presentation. What I want to do is I want to start by talking about what it means to do business-driven security architecture and how that's different than kind of what you see in the norm. And the whole idea here, and actually it was nice hearing Robert Martin talk this morning, and talking about actually being the people that actually enable the organization to do something, manage the risk, but actually help them get there. And that's philosophically exactly what I'm going to talk about today. How do we actually make security an enabler, something that helps protect things, but doesn't actually resist the ability of the business or hinder the ability of the business to be successful. Talk a little bit about some of the common questions and challenges that we see in organizations, and my goal is to go through and explain kind of a practical method of actually doing this, and then show you how you can address some of these challenges. So we're going to talk kind of at a high level in some of the method, but I'm trying to make it as practical as possible. And then certainly as we get to the end, I want you to ask any questions you might have in terms of how you'd actually do this within your organization as we wrap up. Okay. So in terms of Above Security, we're a global IT security provider. We provide services across 50 countries. We're actually headquartered out of Canada. We have there we go. Got to be this close to the thing. Okay. We're an end-to-end security services provider. So this is all we do. So we don't do general IT, that sort of thing. This is all we do. We provide managed security services. We actually have 2 security operations centered in Canada, 1 in Montreal, 1 in Winnipeg, provide bilingual SOC services. We have a very robust professional services team across Canada, the United States, and Switzerland. And that team does a wide range from kind of traditional assessment type of activity, audits, et cetera. But we also do a lot in the space I'm talking about right now, which is enterprise security architecture. And we also do a lot on supporting organization and developing their programs. We also do some solution integration with some of our partners. And then we also are an education provider. So actually, some of the methodology I'm going to talk about here, we actually teach certification courses as well as more streamlined courses for specific organizations. The last thing I should just point out is we have 4 SOCs currently globally. The additional 2 are in Mexico City and 1 in Switzerland. And we're opening up a SOC in Dallas in this calendar year. We're about 150 employees right now. And we operate basically the kind of key areas of operation are in Canada, the US, the Caribbean, Latin America, Switzerland, and Dubai, where we center the work out of for our Middle Eastern work. So that's as far as I'm going to tell you about security. So I just wanted to give you a little introduction. Okay. So the big question is, why do we want to take a business-driven approach? So how many organizations here, I think most people here have come from some sort of IT or security background. How many of you would say that as an IT security organization that you are viewed by the business, whatever business you might be in, might be healthcare, it might be private sector, you're viewed by business as being a partner and an enabler for the organization? One? You don't have to be shy. Put up your hand. The one person will hold up their hand, but not really. But yeah, and that's a challenge, right? So classically, sort of traditionally, I guess, as when we get into the security space, we're often looked at as the department that says no, the people that actually stop us from getting the job done. And so taking a business-driven approach is really about being viewed by the executive, by your senior management, as there to help the business survive, thrive, and be successful. Not there to tell no every time we want to do something that we're trying to expand our business or grow our business or what have you. So I'm going to go through a number of ways of doing this, talk about some of the key models that we would use, and explain kind of the rationale behind it. But I think it's important that I reference some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So I made mention earlier about the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, or SABSA. That's the overarching framework I'm going to talk about today, and so I'm going to talk about the practical application of it. But many of the framework, the concepts, et cetera, are derived from SABSA. Also, I'm making use of some of the open group architecture framework activities as well. And on that front, I was a co-lead on, or currently the co-lead on TOGAF Next security practice. And we just published, actually, so if anybody's interested and knows anything about TOGAF, we just published a paper this month about integrating security architecture, SABSA, and some of the methodologies I'm going to use here into TOGAF. So if you ever have to work with your enterprise architecture team, that's very helpful. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about use of other types of frameworks and practices. One of the nice things about what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these things can actually integrate different types of control frameworks, different types of practice frameworks, ISO, NIST cybersecurity framework, et cetera. So the things I'm talking about here can actually adapt and take advantage of probably what you're using in your organization today. Okay. So the first thing is, what is the objective of my security program? So classically, whenever I ask this question, people build a security program, they say, we're there to protect the assets. Sometimes people say, we're there to stop people from doing stupid things. But rarely do I actually hear somebody actually say, we're there to actually enable and support the organization's objectives and strategies. But at the end of the day, that is exactly why we exist, if we're doing security in an organization. We're there to help them manage risk in order they can be successful. The other thing is that we also need to be able to communicate these linkages. And we have to be able to demonstrate that there's benefit associated with what we're doing, and that benefit is being realized. And that's often a very big challenge in our line of business, because what we're dealing with is a situation where we get crisis funding. We had front page news, and then suddenly we're in a position where funding flows to the security program. But now there's a lot of pressure to actually show that you've succeeded somehow. So I spent $5 million on building my security program this year. At the end of the day, I had no breaches, I had no incidents, etc. Then the business kind of looks at, well, what did I spend $5 million on? Nothing really happened, right? On the other hand, I spent $5 million and I had a breach and it was severe, or even if it wasn't severe, I had a breach. Then the question is, well, what did you spend $5 million on? So it's a catch-22. It's very difficult. And so one of the things that we have to be really careful about is this communication and be able to demonstrate business benefit. And that's why we need to be business-driven, because if we're actually going to talk at an executive level and talk to senior management, we've got to be talking in the terms of risk, but we have to also talk in terms of risk at a business level, not just in terms of risk as we tend to think of it as threats and that sort of thing from a security practitioner perspective. So some of the common things that I get asked and that I work with organizations on. So one we just talked about. So how do I actually demonstrate that there's enablement between the security program and the organization? The second is, how do I actually translate the value of security to the organization? Sometimes that's actually very difficult, and especially to a senior leadership. And I enjoyed Robert Martin's talk earlier in his specific references to, I got to learn how to speak audit. I got to learn how to speak board. And that's what this is about, is being able to communicate effectively. The other thing is, how do I actually know if I'm actually managing risk in the right areas and actually to an acceptable level? A lot of times organizations will do, TRAs, they'll be very solution focused. They won't necessarily have a picture of how risk aggregates or a picture of how things fit together. And so they'll have a sense of assurance, but it's easily picked apart as a result of that. The other aspect is actually that how do I actually use best practice frameworks, because one size doesn't fit all. So how many people here, your organizations use, say, ISO 27001? Yeah, most people. You all work for the same organization, right? No, you don't. And the reality is from different organizations and different industry sectors, you have very different needs when it comes to actually managing risk and worrying about security. So, the United Way as a charitable organization could use ISO 27001, but so could a Department of Defense, if they so chose, right? The reality is it's a practice framework that's there for you to leverage, but you need to know what you're using and how you're going to apply it within your organization and what makes sense. And then the last two pieces here. So one is actually ensuring that my program governance effectively integrates into the organization's governance model, which sounds fairly easy when I state it like that, but is actually very challenging. Many organizations, when I say, well, at the end of the day, who owns the risk? Every CISO will put up their hand and say, I don't own the risk, it's the business. Every CIO or CEO will put up their hand, that's why I have a CISO, right? So how many people here feel that at the end of the day, it's really clear who gets to make risk-based decisions in the organization and that you have the authority to do so? Hopefully a few people will put up their hand. Nobody, that's not good. Okay, we should talk afterwards. I got a great consulting practice around that. Anyways, the last piece is also around how do I ensure that my controls are integrated and working effectively together to optimize value. And when we think about architecture, one of the things you can think about is we're tying things together so they integrate, they're traceable, and they work together. Many times as security practitioners, we think about controls in a discrete fashion. And we think about this control is there to manage this threat, to make sure that we don't have this vulnerability exposed to that threat, but not necessarily thinking about how it all fits together, both at a technical level, business process level, policies, etc. So they all have to fit together. And so how do I know that it's both working together and I'm actually optimizing the value associated with that? So many people would say that you have at least 2 or 3 questions here that will be relevant to your organization. Just quick show of hands if you don't mind. Okay, so most people, that's good. So as we go through this, my goal is really to talk about how do you actually address these questions. So at the end of the day, hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have a comfort level that maybe you won't be able to say, I'm going to go do it tomorrow, but at least you'll understand where you can go, some of the resources and how you're going to get there and take advantage of some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. So the first thing is that we're going to focus on taking a top-down approach. So we start from, and if anybody knows enterprise architecture, they might know about Zachman. So this is actually kind of what was borrowed by the SAPS Institute for actually defining how to do a top-down enterprise security architecture. We need to start at the top level to actually understand what the business is about. We need to understand why we're there, what we're doing, etc. There is many times that I've gone into an organization and I've asked the CISO, can you tell me what your mission is? What are the strategic objectives of the organization? And many times they don't know, which is really unnerving, actually. Because if you don't understand why you're there as an organization, it's very difficult to know what's important and what to protect. Second thing is we actually then move from that contextual view and we start to build out an abstraction or a conceptual architecture through the lens of security. So we're taking some of the things in terms of modeling the business, et cetera, but we're actually looking at it from a lens of security and risk and using that to drive decisions on how things should work overall. So this first level is what I'm going to focus on today, which is really where we're building enterprise security program and architecture. It's really a strategy type of level. However, the goal here is that as you go along and you start to select and you narrow down your scope in terms of what you're going to do, the next layer down is to create security service architecture, where I'm actually going from an architect's view, building out a logical view, and then ultimately preparing for a solution architecture, where I'm actually getting down to implementation. The other aspect that's really important and often missed in many organizations is this last piece here, which is the service manager view. Because at the end of the day, I can build a beautiful architecture, but if it ends up on the shelf and I can't execute it, it was a complete failure. And so it's very important that through all aspects of what we're doing here, we're always going to consider, how do I operationalize that? So one of the key things is we're taking this top-down approach, and it supports the idea that traceability is critical to be successful. And what we mean by that is that it's critical for 2 primary reasons. One is from a completeness perspective. So one of the things that we often have problems with as security practitioners in particular is that we come from a certain background. That background might be from the network background, it might be from a GRC or governance background, etc. And what we'll tend to do is we'll tend to automatically start to focus on the areas that we feel most comfortable. And we'll often start down here kind of in the middle between security services and security mechanisms without really understanding the big picture. So the problem is that we may not actually have a complete view of what's going on. So if we don't have that understanding what the business requirements are and be able to understand how security is going to address that, and then be able to consciously say we're not going to focus on that, we're going to focus on this and prioritize, we have a big risk of actually introducing bias that results in gaps in what we're doing inherently. Does that make sense? The second reason is for justification purposes. I don't know how many organizations I've been in where the security team ends up going to the most recent RSA show. They see some great technology. That's the next thing we need to buy. Because that's exactly where that's where the trends are. We've got a big problem, we need to buy that technology. Or we need to implement this framework, we need to do this practice. The goal here is that by actually understanding the requirements, I start to create the linkages back to make decisions, and I can actually justify why I'm doing things. So I'm not just doing it because it was the latest thing that the most recent vendor came and talked to me about, or because that's what they said at the trade show. I'm doing it because I can actually link it back all the way through these different layers to why the business needed me to do it in the first place. And that goes a much longer way of actually asking for funding than saying I saw it at the RSA show, when you bring your funding proposal or you're looking for money in order to implement your security program. So fundamental to everything I'm going to talk about is this concept that we need to maintain traceability throughout that process. So how are we going to actually do this? So what I want to do is, if you were to take the SABSA course or any sort of enterprise security architecture training, it's kind of 5 days of pretty intense training. What I'm going to try to do is boil it down into a very practical way of walking through this and explain some of the key models and explain how that addresses some of those key concerns we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. So we're going to go through a 3-stage process here. So the first step is really understanding that business context. Out of all 3 phases, this is the most important phase. Why is it the most important phase? Why would this be the most important phase? Yeah, that's who's going to write the check. That's the last phase. But yes, that's important too, yeah. But yeah, you want to make sure you have the requirements. But you want to make sure you're solving the right problem. Nothing worse than you're actually designing an architecture around requirements that you got wrong. Everything else is wrong. So you got to make sure the first phase is right. The second phase is where we're actually going to take some of the modeling techniques I talked about, that I referenced earlier, and we're going to look at the organization, abstract it from an architecture point of view, and look at it through a lens of risk in different aspects of the organization. And then finally, kind of traditionally, you go down, you do your gap analysis. I understand my target state, I understand where I'm starting from, and I build up my strategies for implementation. But there's a twist. Because I said at the very beginning, it's very difficult when you go get that $5 million and either you don't show, nothing happens, or everything happens all at once. How do I actually show benefit without that happening? So that I don't have to wait for a breach or lack of breach to be the way that I'm trying to actually demonstrate that things are going well or they're not going well. So let's step through this process. So in the first phase is, as I said, when we're building the business context, and the first step is actually to build out and understand the business drivers of the organization. The business drivers can be best thought of as, what are my strategic objectives? Are there operational initiatives going on? Are the things that we're doing that actually nobody's recorded anywhere, but we know are really important to the organization because the CEO talks about it every 2 or 3 weeks? We're trying to actually understand what's really important to the organization, what it's trying to achieve. The second piece is we actually build out what we call a business attribute profile. And the goal there is actually to take those business drivers and start to turn it into factors that we can actually assess risk against. So traditionally, when we think about assets, we think about physical assets like a table, we think about logical assets like a database. And what I'm going to talk about is this idea of proxy assets, which is actually about looking at the organization's objectives and goals and attaching a value to that so we can assess risk against it. So let's just do an example quickly to sort of explain this concept. Here's my generic mission statement. Just changed a few names, and it's probably half the organizations here have this similar mission statement. So our mission is to responsibly provide quality products and service through innovation, operational excellence, while sustaining maximum value for our shareholders. Pretty classical kind of mission statement. Normally, if I were to do this exercise, we wouldn't use the mission statement. We'd actually look at strategies, plans, etc. But we'll start here. So I'm going to take the one point here, operational excellence. That's obviously a business driver for this organization. That's important to them. They've put in their mission statement. They've probably built a bunch of initiatives around that. So that's a business driver. So if I take that business driver, what I can start to do is I can look at what are the properties of that driver that are critical for it to be successful. So in this case, operational excellence is referring, it's a a manufacturing firm. So when they talk operational excellence, they're talking about making sure that I have availability of all my systems and services while I'm producing, because days of lost production is lost revenue. It's safe, because I want to make sure I have a safe environment for my workers, I don't want to have downtime, etc., and it's reliable. And underneath that, when I look at it from an IT perspective, all those things become relevant in terms of the types of factors that I'm worried about, that I need to worry about protecting for that organization. So by combining each one of those attributes with my overall business driver, I identify something of value to the organization. And as soon as I've identified something of value to the organization, I can start to think about what is the risks associated with that item of value. So now I can identify key performance indicators, like how I'd measure that value. And I can also identify key risk indicators around the appetite for, or the threshold at which I would cross my risk appetite. So when you think about an easy one such as availability, maybe I have certain systems such as my MRP or something that's actually critical to operational excellence. Availability can be defined in terms of uptime or less or unplanned downtime, perhaps, if you take the opposite view. That becomes my means of actually establishing what my value metric is going to be. And then my risk indicators is how much do I allow for that. So just a very easy example, but you can do that for each one of these attributes to build out what's of value to this organization. The second step is actually now to look at taking this understanding that I have now of the business. I've built out more of an understanding of what's important to the business, built on my attribute profile, and starting to look at risk at an enterprise level across a few different areas. So what I want to be able to do here is I want to look at risk primarily from three perspectives. So the first is taking what I've done with my proxy assets and starting to look at building out a risk model so I can look at what is my inherent risk, where's my residual risk, but even more importantly are what are the things that I can do to actually reduce risk to an acceptable level. So using some of the classical threat and risk assessment type techniques, but going past that to actually model it out and be able to say, what if I were to improve this, if I were actually to track this, if this were to change, how would that influence my risk profile? So I can actually understand overall what are the threats, the gaps in my controls that could affect my ability to achieve those business drivers based on those attributes I was talking about. The second view is around trust. So this is about looking at the relationships at a business level, how those relationships might be enabled by things like IT or different types of services, and understanding, are there assurance gaps, what are my higher risk relationships, and I look at things like how sensitive is the information I'm sharing, how much business operational impact will be associated with that relationship, what type of controls and mechanisms do I have in place to actually manage the risk associated with that relationship. So the first step it allows me to do is understand what are the areas of risk, and then allows me to dig down into the specific relationships. This area actually is one of the areas that I find in most organizations they don't pay enough attention to. They have a huge amount of risk associated with suppliers, partners, et cetera, that have a potentially huge amount of business operational impact or potentially very sensitive information being shared. And yet they're not doing enough to really enforce their policies, their expectations onto those external parties. How many people would think that would be a pretty big risk in your current organization? Just a few? Many people are shy. I suspect there's a few more here. That's almost invariably an area that I see in most organizations that's not well handled. The other area is around the technology domain model, and this is actually looking both within technology layers and also between technology layers that I actually understand how I'm applying technical controls in the environment and making sure that they're integrated and they're actually being layered in a defense in depth approach. I want to make sure that I'm not just placing in individual controls for an individual instance, but I actually understand how it affects many types of threats, many types of vulnerabilities, and I understand how those different controls are layered to work together so that if one fails, I have other controls that are there to actually support, manage the risk or mitigate that situation. And I also want to be in a situation where I actually understand how they work together so that I can optimize the cost around it. So I'm not just creating redundancy, duplication. I might be creating redundancy, but I don't want to duplicate controls that are doing the same things, or they might be just allowing an opportunity to bypass because there's not sufficient layers and it's all focused in one particular layer of the environment. And then the fourth area is around the governance domain model. And this is where I'm looking at overall, how do I actually structure my governance associated with the organization? Where do I set policy? Where do my risk areas occur? Or sorry, where are my risk owned rather? Who has the enforcement associated with those policies, down to a roles and responsibilities layer. And actually even listening to Robert this morning, when he said that everything's about organizational change management, I couldn't agree more. We can do a lot of this very well, but if we don't actually do that well, we will not be effective. Because if they're not actually operating the controls properly, if we're not assuring it, we're not measuring it, and we're not managing it, we're not going to be successful in actually protecting our environments. So what we've done now is actually, maybe before I jump ahead here, so what we've done now actually is really take a lens of risk and security, and we've applied it against relationships, my controls and my threats, as I would look from a traditional perspective, the technology layers within my organization, and also from a governance and roles and responsibilities perspective. So we've kind of covered, taken a well-rounded perspective of what we're doing from a security program perspective within the organization and defined the target state of what we need to achieve or where we want to go with that. The last phase is where we actually start to take those views and we start to understand where are my gaps, how do I prioritize things, and how do I implement strategies to build out the roadmap in terms of how we're going to achieve those objectives. So what we're going to do here is start to understand the gaps. So my risk model allows me to start to interrogate that model, ask questions, and I say, well, where are my highest risk threats? How does risk aggregate around different types of control gaps so that I can understand where I can reduce risk more to the best bang for my buck? What are some of the critical assets in my environment? How do I go from that top level view at a proxy asset level where I'm looking at business objectives and attributes down to what are the supporting IT infrastructure, applications, et cetera. So I start to really understand what my risk profile is for the organization, and I can start to actually model out what would happen if I did this. What that allows me to do is I can actually start to establish what do I need to do over the long term, and how am I going to phase that out, and how much is that going to cost. So I often say you never know what the risk appetite of an organization is until you go and tell them the price tag. So I can say I can go from here to here, and it's going to cost $10 million over 2 years. You've got 5. I now know your risk appetite because I know how far we're willing to go and what I actually associated the level of risk that's acceptable based on the price tag I can afford to put on that. So the idea here is it actually allows you to really understand that equation between value, cost, and risk reduction by being able to actually model it and actually look at different scenarios and what it would result in. The second area is around my trust framework. So now I look at the gaps associated with my third-party relationships, which ones are the highest risk ones, which should I focus energy, and how I'm actually assuring those relationships. Do I have the appropriate contracts in place? Do I have mechanisms in those contracts associated with right to audit to actually demonstrate that they're compliant with my control requirements, to actually do something on an ongoing basis to provide assurance? My technology domain model, where do I have I effectively implemented my layer controls? Where are the gaps associated with that, both within layers and between layers? It allows you to really evaluate too if you're actually applying control at the right level. Sometimes controls are always being focused in many organizations at a network layer without really thinking about what I'm trying to protect, not thinking about what I'm doing in an application layer or a data layer, et cetera. So the goal is to really tie it all together. Do I have my right zoning in place, and do I actually have my assets appropriately placed within my environment? And then the last area and the types of gaps we're looking for is who's accountable for the risk and makes those decisions, who sets and enforces our policies. I have many, many experiences where I've gone to organizations who have policies, but then you ask, well, who approved those policies, and they're still in draft, and they've been in draft for 10 years, right? But people kind of follow them. Well, they're not really policies when they're not actually ratified and actually endorsed and enforceable. And the final area is what are the roles and responsibilities for a security program, and are the people aware? That last point is really important. Many organizations have policies and big racy charts, and when you go ask the person, well, it says here that you do this, and they're like, when did that happen? Well, like 10 years ago when we set this policy up, and they have no idea, right? So the fact that it's an organizational change management process is really key to understand. So it's great to build the matrix associated with the roles and responsibilities, but you also have to get people to buy into that, get engaged, and actually accept that. So based on these gaps, I'm now in a position I can start to think about what I'm going to do in order to get to the point of improvement, reduction of risk, and get to a point of showing benefits to the organization. The first step I've already completed. So I understand my risks, I understand where the risk reduction opportunities are. I understand where my critical risks are because I've actually been able to model that and show what assets are at risk, what are the key areas that I need to focus on, where there's key gaps. I want to understand also what's happening in my environment today. So are there other things that are going on in terms of additional compliance requirements, trends that I need to take into consideration? Because sometimes what's happening today, right now, may not be the right thing to do if I know a year from now it's going to change. I also need to know what my interdependencies are. So it's quite rare that security, based on what the whole concept around security is based on, that you don't have interdependencies with other projects, other areas of the organization who are doing things that could either help the security program or could greatly hinder the security program from being successful. And so you need to understand what the overall dependencies in the project portfolio. And my favorite thing to do is actually build your security program into somebody else's project so that they have the budget to do it. So ideally. And then the final thing is around feasibility and around building out the roadmap. So what am I going to see for quick wins? How long is it going to take to see benefit? What's tactical? What's operational? What's strategic in nature? And what you want to be doing when you build out your roadmap is you don't want to be in a situation where it takes 1.5 years to show benefit. You should be showing benefit every 6 months at least in order to show that something real has happened. I've demonstrably improved the posture of this organization. I've reduced risk. And if you're not doing that, it's very easy to watch that funding dry up very quickly when it's looked at as a boil the ocean type of exercise. And so at the end of the day, I end up building out my roadmap, and it's just traditional project management. So I want to make sure that I have typically what my quick win strategy is over the next 6 months, very projectized approach to it. I understand the sequencing associated with that. So there's nothing worse than get a consultant's risk assessment or audit, and they give you like 500 priorities and give you no sense of how you actually sequence it or what's dependent on what. So it's great if I implement this, but if I haven't done these 5 other things first, it's not going to be effective. So those interdependencies and the sequencing of the projects are very important to being successful. I want to determine my timeline and obviously establish a baseline and measure improvement from a business value perspective. One thing I have now, though, is I've built out that risk model I talked about. So now I kind of understand where I'm starting from. I understand my inherent risk, my residual risk. And so what I have an opportunity to do is I can actually model out what will happen when I implement these changes. I can actually show by actually implementing phase 1 is going to actually reduce risk from the current level down to this level. It's addressing our high risk areas, and it's going to reduce those by 8%. So I'm just using pie charts here. But the concept here is now I can actually show changes in my risk values and my security posture and how it's affecting risk over the phase, and I can actually start to measure benefit and actually relay that to my executive. I can actually show them that something's happening as a result of what we're doing. So the key things we talked about at the beginning were how do we actually build out this view of enabling the organization, et cetera. And one of the things I often get asked is after you're done this, where do you go from here? So what we've been talking about here so far is really the strategy and planning phase and the design phase, that sort of higher end. And now we're going to implementation. So this is the improvement model that we're working off of. And I'm talking about the first phase of building that strategy. But we also now have built out how I'm going to assure from an operational perspective, what are my KPIs, my KRIs, what am I actually measuring? What are the things that are important for me to measure? My governance, I start to establish where my policies are, who's the roles and responsibilities, what are the key assets and everything classified. My security services in terms of that technology domain model, understanding how my controls are working together in tandem, and also how I'm going to deliver these on an operational perspective. The key idea here is now I've actually built out the key factors that I can start to implement and address these different aspects of operationalizing that program. And at the very beginning of the presentation, I said you can design a fantastic architecture, but if you can't operationalize it, you're not successful. And so you need to make sure that all these components are in place in order to be successful at an operational level. So now we have built a business-driven enterprise security program. We've done it based on the business drivers and the objectives of the organization. We've been able to abstract it and then build out our architecture. We can start to show the linkages in terms of how we're enabling and supporting the organization's objectives, because I can actually show traceability down to my decisions down here to the original business requirements. I can start to actually communicate those linkages and explain why we're doing things and justify it based on the business requirements. And I can start to show some benefits realization. I gave one example associated with showing how risk reduction will occur as a result of an investment, so you can actually attach a dollar tag to risk reduction. But I can also show many other ways of demonstrating how the benefits associated with the types of models that I've created, both from a risk perspective, reduction in costs associated with control optimization, being able to show improvements in terms of work activity and productivity gain as a result of better roles and responsibilities. So there's a lot of different factors I can actually start to measure and demonstrate benefit from. And that was 5 days of course in 45 minutes. So I went through that fairly quickly. The one thing I wanted to point out is my goal here was really to give you a sense of what's possible, because a lot of times I talk to organizations and they struggle with just how would something like this work. I'm so tied up in sort of the abstraction of it and how high level it is. How do I actually make something work? And so this kind of gives you a very practical way of building it out. If you're interested in this area, certainly we teach this. You can go to, there's lots of publicly available information around SABSA, around TOGAF, which you can get off of the internet. Some of it you can purchase off of Amazon if you want to actually look at the SABSA book. And then certainly we provide services to support organizations who want to do this and move from being kind of more of a kind of compliance or very tactical focus to a more strategic level of activity within their program. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes?
You talked about assigning a dollar value to risk or risk avoided.
Yeah.
With security ROI. How effective is that with sort of senior decision makers? Do you see those as real potential savings, or is it something that...
So it depends. So it depends what you're showing as the benefit. So I'd rarely justify it based on ROI. What we tend to do is actually demonstrate risk reduction to an acceptable level based on a certain dollar invested. So the reason I say that is because there are circumstances where you can actually demonstrate by actually implementing this set of security services as an example. Not only does it reduce risk, but it will also do this, right? But not everything does that, right? So what we tend to do in terms of showing benefit is you either look at it from I'm reducing risk associated with a threat, or I'm actually enabling an opportunity. So an example of that might be if I'm a financial institution and I actually want to extend my reach into a mobile app type of market, I can actually demonstrate that by actually being able to do this. I can comply and reduce fines. I can actually, in securing that app or securing that entire end-to-end process, I can improve trust within relationships, reduce reputational impact, potentially gain more customers. So there's ways of doing that, but they tend to be a little less tangible, being able to say, by doing this, here's the cost and here's the risk reduction, and I can show you where the highest risk areas are we're reducing. That tends to be the selling point, especially at the board level. Yeah.
Do you have like a figure for, or like an approach for the counter to that? Like if you don't do that action, say for instance, your mobile app, you don't actually secure your mobile app, like what that negative value would be? Oops.
Yeah, so what you can do, sorry, I'm just going to jump back here a little bit. A little faster doing it this way. So the business risk model is a model, and in this particular case, all I've shown is like a few pie charts and stuff, right? But what you can do here is actually you're building out a full risk profile. So you're looking at the threats, you're looking at what the vulnerabilities are associated with. You're attaching it to assets. Those assets do have a value associated with it. So you can actually demonstrate what is the potential business impact associated with if that threat was realized. And if I'm in a very high probability, very high impact threat, associated with high impact and high likelihood threat associated with an area that I'm vulnerable in against an asset. In this case, an asset might be, we're going to take down the manufacturing environment for 2 days. That's very easy to quantify the impact associated with that. Some cases, organizations rely more on reputational impact, and so it might be a little more difficult to actually demonstrate to quantify that. But the key associated with that is actually normalizing your scales associated with the business impact. So I might have reputational, financial, etc. So I might say that being on national news. So I used to be a deputy CEO at a healthcare organization. So we always called it, funding by front page, where whatever happened on the front page became the next day's funding envelope, right? So we actually, when we looked at actually creating a business impact scale, we actually associated national news, negative news as being at the same level of business impact as, like, say, $1 million of loss. So the benefit of doing that is now I can actually characterize, based on the types of threats and the likelihood of threat, what is the potential business impact. And as soon as you start talking business impact, it's a lot easier to have a discussion with your senior management member to say, here's the likelihood of occurring as we see it, here's the types of threats, but here's the impact that you should be aware of if this were to occur. And that's where you start to quantify what happens if I don't do it. But it's very rare that you won't have so every organization will say almost every organization will say that we're pretty conservative, we have a very low tolerance for risk, right? But the reality is until you actually say, here's how much it's going to cost, you truly don't know the risk appetite of that organization. And it's not that they don't want to do it, it's just that they have other priorities for that funding, as an example, they can't afford it. But that still is a definition of the risk appetite they're accepting as a result of that. Did that answer your question? Yeah, probably too much. I went too far with it. So. Any other questions? That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate you listening to me, and hopefully I've added some value to your life associated with what you want to do with your program. Certainly I'll be around afterwards if anybody wants to talk about or have any other questions. And thanks very much, and thanks for the conference for allowing me to speak. Appreciate it.